presentation. Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. Today, we're talking about one of my most absolute favorite things to do, fishing for topwater, fishing bass with topwater lures. It is so fun. If you've never tried it, we have so many great places to do that and to do this in Minnesota. And we're really excited today. We have with us Eric Altena, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit what we're going to cover today. Generally, when you go out fishing, it's good to know about the fish, where you'll find them, and then what the presentation would be. So we're going to kind of cover that process as we go through. And then, like I said, we'll have time for questions at the end. So start out with who we are going to have with you today, your guides for this trip. Going to start with Eric. Eric is one of our fisheries managers in DNR Fisheries, Fish and Wildlife, and I'll let Eric take away and describe a little more on his background and expertise.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the invite and the opportunity to kind of talk about one of my true loves. I've been involved in a lot of different things. I'm actually one of the main people on the bass technical team and the work group, as well as, I've been doing a lot of fishing over my 56 years of being alive. And I help out with high school team angling, a founder of the Mississippi Smallie Club, trolling for Troops River Guide. I do some guiding on the side as well. So it's a lot of fun. And I feel it's pretty unique to be able to integrate the biology with the actual angling thing. And that's the beauty of it. I truly enjoy fishing for smallmouths. Are by far my favorite. But certainly this is one of my favorite things too as well, Jeff. So it's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully we can help some people out.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to join us, Eric, today. It's really great to have your expertise, especially in the smallmouth area. I love catching smallmouth, but I just don't have a lot of options where I've fished a lot, so to catch them. So it's great to have you here to talk about that fun fish to catch. I'll also be helping to give you some ideas and suggestions. Again, I work in the Fish and Wildlife outreach section, doing coordination of our education and skills programs, and really excited to be able to share what we do and how much fun it is to get out, go fishing. I did work for many years at a camp called Camp Fish that was a really great place. There were no secrets, which is one of the nice things about working there. Everybody shared everything, and we learned a ton from each other, so it was really fun. And then many years ago, I started the Fishing Daughters Club and did a lot of bass fishing with the girls, and it was a great opportunity to get out intentionally. Every week we went out, regardless of whether the lawn needed to be mowed or what. And so I really encourage you to get active in some kind of club or, intentional activity like that. It actually makes you get out. So it's a great way to be able to do that. And I was on a couple of different fishing lanes, which is a wonderful opportunity again to learn and to actually spend time outside. So with that, we'll get started. We're going to talk about bass biology. That is one of Eric's areas of expertise as a fisheries expert. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric to kind of walk through what we know or what we should know about bass and how that can make us a better angler.
Absolutely. So obviously we're starting with largemouth bass. I mean, these guys are found in most of the lakes in Minnesota. They're prolific throughout the United States, and probably one of the more popular species to fish for when you look at it nationwide. Obviously there's tournaments and all that stuff around, but when we talk about the biology, these guys are built for eating sunfish. I mean, that's kind of their primary forage is sunfish. They obviously love frogs and crayfish and everything, but their mouths are made to eat sunfish. That's why their mouths are so big. And just a real quick tip on the identification stuff, the maxillary bone or that jaw bone, it'll extend past the eye on a largemouth. Sometimes they're green. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they can be really bleached out, just depending upon the water clarity, what environment they're in. And they actually have the ability to change color within a matter of about 15 minutes or so. So that's something you ought to think about in identifying the species. But they are a top level predator. They grow fairly fast, although we do have individuals that have been around in some of our lakes in central Minnesota for over 25 years. So they can get older, but certainly, if you catch a fish that's in that 18 to 20 some odd inch range, more than likely they're over 12 years old. So it's kind of cool to see them, but they've been around a while, and just obviously there's a lot of variables in there, but certainly they're fun to catch, no question about it.
And one thing, talking about the biology, the eyes are placed such that topwater fishing, they feed on the surface a lot because of that, their biology, right?
Yeah, exactly. And most fish are kind of that way. Most fish in freshwater are, where their eyes are kind of on on an angle to where they actually can see up a lot better than most other critters. So
Great.
yeah.
Okay, the other really common bass that we have that is great to fish on topwater in Minnesota is smallmouth.
hmm So smallmouth bass, more evolved in river systems, and their definite preferred forage is crayfish. Now, there's times a year where these guys will actually be so beat up that their noses and our mouths are kind of skinned from trying to get after crayfish so bad. But their favorite is definitely the crayfish, and their growth is it can be variable, but like in the Mississippi River here, which is I work in Little Falls, so right in central Minnesota, these things are growing about 12 inches to age 4, or 4 to age 4, 12 inches, 5 around 13 or so. And if you catch one over, say, 19 inches or so, that thing could be easily 15 to 18 years of age. And that's what we found by doing the work and looking at the biology. They tend to prefer a little bit cooler water temperatures. They'll spawn a little bit earlier. And again, the coloration is a cue, but it's not necessarily 100%. If you catch them out of a stained water environment, sometimes they'll be really, really bleached out. So those brown sides or whatever, and even the unique coloration, the war paint, so to speak, on their faces, might not stand out as much. And it's actually pretty cool. These things are very aggressive predators. The red eyes kind of tend to be that can vary quite a bit, but they're definitely aggressive predators, and obviously topwaters are a very fun way to fish for them. That jaw, that's by far the easiest way to tell the difference between largemouth and smallmouth. And just as I mentioned with the largemouth, that maxillary bone, it'll come if you draw an imaginary line down the middle of the eye. In the smallmouth, it'll be even with it or in front of it. In the largemouth, it'll be behind it for sure. So easiest way to tell, and certainly they love sunny weather. That's one tip that I think a lot of people neglect. So largemouths tend to prefer, it's cooler and even rainy days. Sometimes you can catch them on topwater really well. On the other hand, the smallmouths, if you're out in sunny weather, you can catch fish all day long on at least on rivers anyway. Sometimes even lakes too. So
Yeah, and I think somewhat related to that too is our rivers tend to be a little more dark stained, so fish are a little more active, and we'll talk a little bit more about that probably as we go through about when's the best time to fish. But thanks, that's really good information. And again, just to emphasize that we have tremendous bass fishing
that's fantastic.
across all of Minnesota, basically. And so, smallmouth might be a little more common in the north, but we have some great river fishing, and especially our bigger rivers. I have
Absolutely.
caught an 18-inch smallmouth within a rock's throw of a huge skyscraper in downtown Minneapolis. And you were talking about even right in St. Cloud, there's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
awesome
It's
fishing.
we had the governor's fishing opener here in 2017, and it was kind of an eye opener for some folks that we have this fishery right in everybody's backyard. So it's really kind of cool. And actually, this picture that's on the screen right there in the PowerPoint, that's a friend of mine that I took out from Arkansas, and those fish were caught within 10 feet of each other, and they're almost totally different in coloration. But that is also right in town. So
Yeah. Yeah, we have no excuses in Minnesota to
no,
catch bass.
no.
All right, let's talk a little bit about where to fish and locations that are really, beneficial. Um, this is a classic photo actually taken. I have a place in West Central Minnesota. It's on one of our back lakes, and you see this great amount of emergent and submergent vegetation. And these are prime bass habitats, especially for largemouth. And so vegetation is really key. You can see pockets in there where there's room for the fish to maneuver around, although they will go in the thickest. You cannot imagine how thick of stuff they can get in, or even how shallow. I mean, caught them in like 6 to 8 inches actually, but looking for pockets. And I have found transition areas where different types of weeds, and this kind of goes back to this structure that you find all kinds of wildlife, not just fish, relate to edges. So where you can see a change or an edge in the shoreline, or the type of cover, the type of vegetation. Seems like we have 3 different kinds of vegetation coming together. That's usually a lot of times some of the best places to go. But that's some of the tips I would recommend for bass fishing is if it's proximity to deeper water, and we'll talk more about that, but those are some of the key things when you're starting to scope out when you go to a piece of
Mhm.
water, where you might want to start in the lake, because there may be fish everywhere, but there certainly are places that are better.
Yeah, like Jeff mentioned, I mean, just the changes and transitions. If you see higher density changes, even in like bulrush, for example, those what people call pencil reeds, or the cattail, or in this case, lilies. If you see density changes, oftentimes those are really good spots to concentrate on, or at least put casts nearby. It increases your odds. It's not necessarily guaranteeing a fish, but at least it increases the odds of seeing something or getting a reaction strike.
Although I would say when you go across the lake, there's many times where you go, there's got to be a fish there, right?
Right.
Now, it doesn't always work, but many times once you fish a lot, you can identify those prime areas. So
Absolutely. Yeah. For smallmouths, obviously, that the current breaks and eddies, when we talk about river systems, those are a little bit different. We have a lot of things that affect fish in river systems, and flow being the majority one, or that is the largest component that seems to affect fish distribution and even activity to some extent. So you have to be a little bit aware of that, and they always look for current breaks. I mean, if you think about it, a smallmouth bass in the Mississippi River is running on a treadmill for its entire life, right? That's basically what the equivalent would be. So they need to have areas that they take a break in, and that's what we call an eddy. So those areas that don't have as much current, those are key, especially when the water flow is really, really high. And even during the times like last year when it was super low and drought conditions, there's places that are better than others. They might be in the fast water for some time, but not all the time. So it's just something to keep in mind.
and then rocks, of course. I don't
Yep.
know if you mentioned that
Yeah.
there. And is there a particular kind of rock that is better than not for smallmouth?
As the bass pros always say, well, you gotta look for some chunk rock, man. So, right. So I mean, it depends on what we're talking about. It depends on the scenario. Most of the Mississippi River, you're going to see sort of rounded rocks, and if you get groupings of those, that tends to be pretty well. Similarly, in lakes, if you get areas where there's boulders or larger rocks that actually provide those interstitial spaces, those areas that have cavities for crayfish to hang out, that's usually the ideal habitat. The
Yeah,
food's there, the fish will usually be there. So
right. It's back to the food. Yeah.
yeah.
So what time of year? Well, my classic response to this, if someone asks, when should I go fishing? Whenever you
Right.
can. You never know when you're going to get out there when the bite is on. So there's
Yeah.
nothing replaces getting out whenever you can. Yeah, certainly certain weather conditions are going to be better, or at least better to fish in.
Hmm.
But there are times, definitely, especially when it comes to top water, that are better. And a lot of it, again, relates to the food. So there, our frogs in Minnesota, they spend over winter in these deeper lakes. So they survive making it through winter by going and migrating from their small wetlands where they have their eggs and where the young are growing during summer, and then they move to these deeper waters. So if you can find a spot where there is good wetland cover or places where there's a lot of frogs, and then they move during the fall into the lakes and in the spring in reverse back into those wetland areas, and they will often do that in mass. In fact, I know those folks that have driven around Minnesota a lot, you can see, especially wetter evenings where you have some rain, you can go across highways where they are in between a wetland and a lake, and you will see tons and a lot of dead frogs, unfortunately, being hit by cars and see them.
Yep.
Mark those areas down on your map or in your head, because you want to be back out there on that shoreline, potentially catching big fish that are taking
Hmm.
advantage of that. So
Yeah, I think when we break it down to what temperatures are good. I mean, top water is not a thing to be able to do, obviously, in the middle of winter. It doesn't necessarily work unless, I mean, you're in a hot water discharge area, for example, right? I mean, that's a different scenario.
on a
But
river somewhere, yeah.
yeah, but generally speaking, you're looking at about 55 degrees on up. Okay. And then certainly, if I'm going to go fishing on a day that's right after a major cold front, I'm probably not going to be using top water as a search lure, because that's, fish are going to be a little bit put off, especially in lakes. Rivers, maybe not so much, but certainly, in the summertime, we get a significant cold front, and all of a sudden you have these blue sky days the day after. It may or may not be the best opportunity, but anything above 55 degrees, I mean, I'm always looking to at least have an opportunity to throw top waters, whether it's for search baits or whatever. But as Jeff mentioned, the frog thing is a huge deal. Near spawning areas for the frog migrations, and then early and late in the day, we call fish, at least bass in particular, as well as things like walleye. They're especially designed for late night activities, but we call most fish crepuscular, which means that they prefer those times between basically when it starts to get dark and when it's getting light, right? So even though you can catch smallmouth all day long and bass all day long on top waters at times, that key feeding time is usually going to be early or late. So,
And what's the advantage, or why is that the case,
well,
biologically speaking?
yeah. So, if you think about the way that the light changes and the angles of the sun change and everything, it offers more shade opportunities and more ambush opportunities. Not to mention that usually the activity and predation potential, I guess you want to call it, for the forage is less when it's darker. So the fish obviously become more active. They're following the feed that are, the fish that are going up. When we do our night electrofishing, it's amazing what you see in shallow water. Like you mentioned, 6 inches of water or less sometimes, and on out into that weed edge or whatever. It's just alive with fish. And I mean, we're talking young of the year bluegill, young of the year minnows, whether the blunt nose minnows or silver sides, and all that stuff is usually up near the surface and in shallow water. So it makes perfect sense. Well, yeah, if those fish are there and active, well, then certainly the big predators are going to be not too far behind. So.
Yeah, and related, a couple things I want to point out about that picture. You can see the eye. Really, I mean, these predators have good sized eyes. That
Yeah.
gives them an advantage under those low light conditions over some of the prey.
Yeah.
And then, speaking of how some of these um, biomes or the more activity in the shallow water makes it perfect for shore fishing
Hmm.
and shoreline. In fact, there's a 20-inch bass that I caught last fall in the middle of October or late October, actually, when I'm clear, I know they were chasing frogs probably, but just from shore.
Yeah.
I have a boat, but it's wonderful right at sunset. Just go out, make a few casts and see what I can get.
Yeah.
10 times in a row, I won't catch a thing, but then that night I also caught a 19-incher. So
Yeah.
again, back to the point that you got to be out there, and
Yeah.
it's a great technique. Mimicking the frog in this situation. That was on a
Sure.
buzzbait. The other one I caught on
Yeah.
a frog imitation. So, yeah, get out there. And that the last point there in the slide. Yes, early and late in the day can be really good, but you want to talk maybe about even the middle of the day. This reaction strikes you can see.
Yeah, I mean, you can concentrate on some areas that, where the habitat is good or where you probably have, like a hump, a sunken island, for example, that has a vegetation that tops out at, the hump is down in 15 feet of water or something, and their vegetation comes up to around 8. Some of those spots, you can actually trigger strikes with topwater. Similarly, points or edges, near like a vegetation stuff that's like behind Jeff's image there. You can find those edges and points and pockets that are actually near some deep water, and you can trigger strikes at times from fish that are hungry. And I mean, they're not that smart, right? So if we think about it, their brains are the size of the tip of your pinky for a really large bass. So they have some basic reactions, and one of which is that they see food and they really want to just go get it most of the time. Not all the time, but certainly the vast majority of the time, they're going to react to the stimuli that's presented. So.
And I think, well, both species, I guess, do in the summer spend a lot of time in deeper water, but there's always a few that are up shallow. In fact,
That's
I've
true.
seen some research down in some of the reservoirs in southern United States where it's 90-degree water temps,
Yeah.
and they track fish, and there are bass that hole up in vegetation or whatever, or around a stump or a dock all summer long, even when it's that hot. So, if you really love this technique, you can get way back, and we'll talk a little about that in a little bit. You're going to find places that and fish up there, and
Mhm.
some big fish.
Absolutely.
So speaking of that, getting
Mhm.
back and finding getting those fish, let's talk about gear. And specifically, I'm talking about what you're looking at in the photo and some of the other pictures we talked about. These fish can and do survive and do really well, especially if there's access to some deeper water where they can cruise in and out. We'll be in that stuff. Folks will work this, but how many people get way to the back? Because like this year, like where those cattails are,
Yep.
it's still 3-4 feet deep.
Mhm.
So there'll be fish in there. So you need heavy equipment, heavy duty, to be able to do that. I actually, again, cheap. I haven't spent a lot of money on rods and reels. I'm using some of my old musky rods because that gives me, the heavy action and the reels that can be heavy enough. Because once you hook a fish back in there, you got to get them out immediately. Because once
Mhm.
they wrap you around a lily pad or something or a bulrush, it can be impossible to get them out. So if you never learn how to use a bait caster, here's the time I'm going to suggest you might want to try. You can use a heavier spinning reel, but
Absolutely.
just for pound gear ratios, cranking, be able to get a big fish out, a bait caster is going to be more effective for you. And And then you can talk. Yeah, why don't you mention line and what we should look at
Yeah,
there?
so I mean 30 to 40 is probably my minimum if I'm going to be fishing the cover like that's in the presentation there. You know, I actually have 65-pound work rigged up on my frogging rod specifically to be able to one cast and then feel comfortable not having to worry about getting through that stuff, because it actually will cut through some of that vegetation. When you first hook set, it can, because the line is thinner diameter and can, you know, kind of cut through that a little bit. It does help get those fish out at least more efficiently. And then we're enjoying to be able to catch the fish. We want to try and return them in some cases, whatever, you know, as quickly as possible. You don't want to hurt the fish per se, so we're trying to give it an opportunity to get back, and you know that it's our responsibility to do that as efficiently as we can. So that's definitely part of it. I like also to use a longer rod like Jeff's talking about. You know, sometimes a musky rod might be a little excessive, but it's certainly not bad. But heavy action rods, 7+, you know, 7'2" is kind of what I lean towards, and then I like to use a little bit higher gear ratio to be able to get it, you know, up on top of the surface and then be able to bring it right in out right away. So
Well, one of the advantages using that is heavier tackle too, as I mentioned in the title there, bycatch. The biggest muskie I've ever caught was on a frog in the lily pads.
yeah,
And I've had another one on top water caught in my boat, was over 40 inches. So yeah, so you're ready for that if that happens. And it
absolutely.
does happen more often than not. So
You are correct for sure.
a
So I
couple
mean,
other,
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just gonna suggest definitely have a net. The pliers are
Yeah,
always
so
handy. So yeah,
getting into the other gear,
yeah.
yes, a net, especially with these bigger fish. And related to that, can you want to go over some of the new rules or the new opportunities for record fish?
Yeah, so there are some length categories, but you need to kind of keep track a little bit. So ideally, it's on a bump board. That would be a measuring board that has an angle to it, and you can put the fish on there and take a picture of it and everything. Getting length and girth is pretty important if you want to try and put in for a record. But there's all kinds of new opportunities now because many of our records were really old, and we've actually opened them up to new opportunities, you know, for current record holders. So it's sort of like a new page opened in the record books to be able to provide that opportunity. And we have different, you know, fisheries now than they were back in the 40s and 50s and 60s when many of those records were set. So it's kind of a unique opportunity to be able to do that. So check out the records program. It's well worth participating if you get some bigger fish.
For a lot are catch and release
Yeah.
that are
Yes.
including both largemouth and smallmouth. And then
Absolutely.
certified weight is also been reopened or is open
Mhm.
for the smallmouth this
Mhm.
year, just started. So yeah, and yeah, Cassie or Benji, maybe you could, I don't think we have that down on the links, but that'd be a good one to add that folks want to see the web page that has all that information. And we
Yeah.
actually also had a presentation just a few months ago. Andy told us all about the program and give you a lot of details about how the steps you need to take to make sure you actually qualify. But this is a great opportunity to have yourself in the record books. And now related needle nose plier or something like that to help get the hooks out, because in some cases we're dealing with treble hooks, and it really helps to have that. A hook sharpener, especially getting back in this vegetation and wood and rocks, you're going to have your hooks get dulled. And so it's really critical to keep those sharp so that you're able to land those fish. And then I always like having a towel handy. And of course, we talked about measuring and cameras. Well, here we are, moving on to presentation. And
Mhm.
again, we're talking topwater. There are a ton of ways to catch bass in Minnesota, but like I said, having those fish explode on these baits and seeing that action, and they like to jump a lot. It's just so much fun to be able to use this presentation and try to catch fish on topwater. Several different categories we can touch on. Fish, we talked about the frogs, and you can see a lot of them look like or imitate frogs, but minnows can be really effective, and not just for bass. I mean, the classic floating rapala. I've caught a bunch of walleyes
Yeah,
on a floating rapala in certain conditions like that, and of course northerns
absolutely.
and other fish love them too. But these are all shallow running. Obviously, there are deeper running crankbaits you can use too, but there are a bunch of them that you can buy that can be really effective. Now, you're not going to fish these right in the middle of the weeds, probably, right?
Yeah, not any of these. So I mean, I did bring a few for show and tell. So these are different style frog. This happens to be a Spro variety. It has a little weight back in the back there, but it allows you to really throw it quite a ways. And if you work it right and have like I like to use a little clip on these, and actually you can walk them much like a dog walking type bait or kind of a stick bait, as they might call it. The other options too are is actually going with completely soft plastic. Sorry about the screen deal. So this is just basically what they call a toad or a, they got all different kinds of names for these things. I'm not a name brand specific kind of person, but the ideal thing is that you can rig these weedless just like you would a Texas rig or like a Texas worm, Texas rigged worm, and they'll be almost as weedless, and they make like a little chopping sound that comes through that. So it's also another opportunity. They make this looks very simple, but all it is basically a stick bait that is soft plastic. Again, it's another opportunity. And then finally, what I like to call jerk shads, right? They're very similar to looking to a fish, and they have an area where the hook resides right there in the slot, and similar kind of concept. You can work it through that stuff, and it's very weedless and a little bit different presentation that can give you some opportunities rather than having to count on something that has the big treble hooks. So buzz baits are great, but they also kind of clog up around any vegetation, whether it's filamentous or some smaller, lesser pond weeds or whatever. So it is kind of tough at times to try and get back in that stuff. So these offer a little bit opportunity that might be different than just throwing a frog. So
Yeah, and on my background, and we are probably small on your screen right now, but you can see the different variety of cover there. And when you're on the outside edge, at least in a lot of our central Minnesota and northern Minnesota lakes, there's not as much weed cover, especially earlier in the summer. And you can work some of these that have treble hooks or the popper or the hula popper or the buzzbait and not worry too much about the weeds. As you get deeper in that and you have more weeds during the summer, some of the weedless options like you were talking about are really great. The frog imitators in particular, a lot of them are weedless because as you see in that picture, and maybe you can see on this, the frog rides with the hooks up, so they're not exposed to the weeds. They're up against the plastic body, and they're really great for getting almost weedless through anything, even the scummiest, muckiest things that you have that are out there, because it just rides right over the top of it. Now, presentation on this. I know you work them quick, and you mentioned some sort of a clip to help with
yep,
walking the dog that makes it
yep,
go back and forth, which is a really cool presentation, especially since for those stick baits like that. I
hmm
believe it's there a spook on the very bottom row there that I
yep,
have. Um, but I also like, if you can be patient enough, bass are like cats.
hmm
They like to stalk their prey. They'll sneak up on it and they'll watch it and they'll wait. And they just can't stand it when nothing's happening. Just like playing with your cat with the little mouse that you're twitching around on the floor. They get more anxious or excited the longer it stays in one spot. I
sure,
mean, I don't know how many times because I'm usually running the motor, I'll cast it out there and then I got to shift the motor or do something else in the boat, and the bait sitting there for several seconds, and then all of a sudden, oof,
yep,
usually when you're not ready for it. But yeah, that anticipation, and especially like you even you hide your mouse with your cat underneath a blanket or whatever, and it's
hmm
just kind of moving under the blanket. They just drives them crazy. Same with bass. They see it maybe moving on that lily pad, and as soon as it comes to the edge of the lily pad, woof. So that's some tips on kind of how to present these. Prop baits, kind of the same thing,
yep,
because you move them, and one of the things I've always kind of been told, when their fish are there and there's a good chance you're going to get them to do that strike, is throw out the bait and let it wait until some of the ripples dissolve. That's how long you want to wait. So we're talking a few seconds. But I know you also had some advice on when you finally get a strike, what do you do?
Well, one of the things you need to do, all right, is you have to wait, right? Like I know Jeff said, waiting for just to be able to have the lure set. But honestly, when you get a actual fish to strike it, you have to wait for the feel, and that's the hardest part. And one of the things that takes some training as an angler, especially if you're new to topwater fishing, is to wait for the feel, the pull of it, not just watching what you see. And this is really one of the hardest things I think as an angler, anyway, to train yourself to do. Is I got to wait to actually feel the fish, and then I go ahead and set the hook, right? Because if I If I set the hook instantly every time, it's a little tougher because the fish has to open its mouth. And if it's up near the surface, it might catch some air and it might not be as efficient in doing so. So you waiting just a little bit of a second allows it to grab its mouth around those hooks, and then you can actually get the hook to penetrate some other stuff. Versus if you set the hook immediately, the mouth might still be somewhat open or, impeded from getting it, especially if you're on vegetation and everything. They can have all kinds of crap in their mouth when they're trying to feed. So it's like, it does vary. And I think that general rule of thumb certainly applies. And then kind of going back to the pauses, something that's unique about smallmouth. I didn't think about this the last time when we were talking about this, but smallmouth really respond to pauses a lot, right? So if you are working a bait, like for example, this is a whopper plopper, right? And if you do a pause, like a jerk pause, that's where 90% of those hits occur, right? So similarly to what you're saying, with the bass in general, but certainly more so even with smallmouths, is that they respond to those pauses really well. So
Yeah,
for the
and we're
hooks, that
trying,
thing,
yeah,
wait, but yeah,
we're trying to match the hatch, right? We're
right.
trying to imitate whether it's a frog or a dying fish.
Mhm.
They'll sit there for a long time, and all of a sudden they get a little bit of energy if they're dying, and they move, and then that indicates, for the fish, it's like, I got a free meal here. So,
Exactly.
yeah, trying to imitate the bait. All right, we have some additional resources for you. I know Cassie and Benji have been putting them up in the chat too, but there's a lot of resources on our website about if you're just getting started on fishing, what you can do to learn more about fishing. And there's some that are specific. We have a lot of this information we covered on the presentation on the website, with particular about bass and bass fishing. So go ahead and check those out when you have a chance. We have some time now for some questions. I know a couple other topics that we want to hit, but I'm going to stop sharing so that we can even show maybe some more of the baits or some of our
Yeah.
tackle if people have questions about that. I do want to talk about color. Obviously, again, I think usually it's pretty critical to match. What we're trying to do again is match the bait or the prey. I mean, that we're trying to that the fish are trying to eat. So do you have any general guidance on that or suggestions?
Well, I mean, if you look at the the lure industry in general, I think a lot of it is meant for us as anglers that
Trying to
we
catch a
think looks good.
fisherman.
Exactly. I mean, if you think about the basic colors that fish are, right? What do they look like on the bottom? Their prey species are going to be something like orange, like a bluegill, for example, or white, right? Looks like a bottom of a frog, or in certain cases, a fish. Okay, so there's some basic colors that generally are represented by what's available in nature, and that's kind of what I gear towards. I'm not saying that there's other colors that don't work. I mean, certainly chartreuse, you're not going to see that in nature, right? But yet, it's something that is a color that definitely attracts attention of fish at times. I mean, what smallmouth in their right mind goes for a spinnerbait that's a giant half-ounce spinnerbait has a chartreuse blades and chartreuse body, and you're burning it on the surface? What the heck? I mean, that doesn't represent anything that you eat, but yet it's a reaction strike. So I think it really varies. But I guess I would always lean towards like the basic colors. Like with this whopper plopper is a white, has a little bit of a darker top or whatever, but that bottom, that's what fish is seeing. So it's definitely, like Jeff had mentioned, some darker colors. Some at times, like at night, it actually is better to go with a little bit darker presentation because that profile stands out on the top water. But generally speaking, I have real basic color combinations, and it's nothing that's that fancy. And then I think, at least in my own mind, the industry is kind of geared towards, let's attract the angler because it's good for buying stuff, right? So
Well, you just, this is a natural color, right?
yes, yeah.
Of all the perch, probably
Mhm.
imitation, and fish are designed that way, and frogs really also dark on top and white on the bottom
Yep.
because they cannot be seen as you were saying. You
Yep.
can't see them as well from underneath because they're white. So when a fish
Mhm.
looks up, it sees the light sky and it can't see the light fish. And conversely, if you're looking from the top down in the dark into the
Mhm.
dark water from the top, the water's darker and the fish can't be seen because they have their darker top.
Exactly.
So as you were just saying, you should do the reverse of that
Mhm.
if they're feeding up, because then bait will stick out more, whether it's a dark green or a black,
Sure.
especially at nighttime, because as you said, it gets darker and that silhouette is more visible. So that's my tip for coloration, I guess, particularly with topwater.
I would agree.
We do have some good questions. Jay asked, do you have to fish shallow water using topwater lures? And you gave some examples, I think, of some plastics, which depending on how they're weighted, and there's a lot of weedless type spoons and other things, Texas rigging, a Nike, a worm, which basically you're sinking the plastic in, the hook into the plastic so it becomes weedless, and then you push, you have a bullet shaped hook that slides through weeds really easy.
Yeah. But as far as you know, the depth of water that where top waters can be effective, I think kind of your number one rule of thumb is that how deep is that water to start with? Okay, so I mean, you mentioned you know only shallow. Well, it's not necessarily the case. I have run into some scenarios. I used to live in Texas, and we fished in a couple New Mexico reservoirs, and they were very clear. So we would honestly, that technique I was talking about with the big chartreuse spinnerbait, that was a thing that we literally were burning it and bulging the surface with the blades in 15 feet of water. 15 feet of water those fish were coming out of to nail that thing because of that aggressive presentation. So it really does vary on the situation. I would argue that the more clear the water is, that the better success you have a potential to have with the top water and deep water presentation, right? Just because the fish have the visibility to be able to see that. The more dirty or dingy the water is, the less opportunity that deep water might be an option for using a top water for sure. So.
And you touched on cold front conditions or high pressure, and that will affect their activity and mood level. There's no doubt. So their range of striking or motion is going to be less. So then you're going to in those cases, especially if they're down in deeper water, you're less likely to catch them on the top. But when the feed bag is on, and you could be in 20 feet of water and they will be coming up and get it if they can. And this kind of relates to Jay's other question about how fast you have to reel the lures through the surface. And I think it's a matter of trying different stuff, right? I mean, it's easy to get stuck in like this always works or this is the way I want to fish, but I challenge you to try different things until you find something that works. Obviously, if something is working well, then keep doing it.
Yeah, there's times when I mean I can be burning a buzzbait across certain areas, and that's what generates a strike. But other times you barely have to crawl a thing or whatever, So there really is a variety. And I think Jeff's advice about when you're using a frog style bait, probably the best presentation you can have is trying to mimic what nature does. And I mean sometimes those frogs panic when they're first crossing some areas, maybe open water, they're going a little bit faster, and then when they get on a pad they slow down or whatever. And it's never a consistent, walk, 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 walk. It's always they go for a little bit and then they stop. They go for a little bit and then they stop. So mimicking what nature does is pretty effective, generally speaking.
If folks have other questions, plug them in and into the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them as we have time. Anton said, I've heard that topwater fishing works best in calm water. To what extent is that true? Does it depend on the type of lure you're using or anything else?
Yeah, I think at least personally speaking, it depends on the noise making ability. Like if you have a heavy chop, obviously that the fish is going to have a little bit more trouble seeing things, and that's where when we show those lure types. I mean, this is a generalized popper, right? And has a kind of a deep dish face, and that can make quite a big splash depending upon the variety that you have. So those can be effective into maybe even 1 foot or so waves, and even like walking style baits like the Zero Spook that Jeff was holding up earlier. Those can make quite a bit of splash if you work them pretty aggressively. So they can be effective when you have some chop on the water in a lake, for example. In rivers, I never underestimate what fish can see. I don't know how they do it, but it's amazing when there can be like a standing wave nearby and you can work a buzzbait right near it and all of a sudden the fish will, pop it. So it's like, it really varies depending upon the environment, but I would argue that, if you get about that 1 foot chop or less, you're probably fine and working or trying to work some topwater opportunities.
This is a buzzbait with multiple blades on it. So, buzzbaits in particular, I think with a little bit of a wind or wave can work well because they still, as you said, kick out a lot of action that the fish can still see them. So that's one of the topwater baits that I'll use when it's a little bit more windier.
One tip too, if you have the opportunity to work parallel with the waves, you can actually make a presentation work in larger
Mm.
chops. So something to think about, like if you're fishing a shoreline and the bow is paid in the boat, for example, or if you're wading and you're facing into the wind, if you cast parallel to those waves, you can actually work those baits and get some reactions out of it that you might not have if you're working either downwind or upwind. So just a
Yeah, good tip. Scott asks, around docks and structure, do you feel topwater lures are better than, say, a Texas rig plastic worm?
I don't know. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, classic response. It depends. Uh, you know, if you know the frogs are going and then they're migrating, and it's the bite is on with frogs, especially like early in the spring, maybe, or that fall bite we're talking about, you might do better with a topwater.
Yeah.
The advantage with a worm is that you can fish it deeper, and in the case of a dock, potentially you can get under the dock, especially if the fish are less aggressive. And some of the top waters, also not the frog maybe, but some of these other ones that we've been looking at have a lot of treble hooks. So you you don't want to be hooking someone's canopy or their wires on their boat. So you do have to be careful with some of those baits too.
I've had pretty good success doing like a weightless worm or weightless Senko actually, and then kind of working it near the surface. But the beauty is that you can actually skip those underdocks pretty easily
Hmm.
if
Hmm.
they're wacky rigged or even Texas rigged with just no weight on it. But you can skip those very easily, and you can make them function just like a topwater. But then they have the ability to also drop. But I guess I would argue top water is great and it can be very reliable, but it also it tends to be more of a let's find what the fish or where some active fish might be. It might not necessarily be the best way to guarantee a catch off of a given dock, for example, right? I mean, I think
Hmm.
if you have something that presents itself right in front of the fish, your odds of actually getting a hook set in something like that with a jig or a Texas rig worm might be a little bit better than with a topwater. The topwater is kind of it's a little bit of a gamble, but it can be very
Hmm.
productive. There's no question. And there's reasons pros use them. So, you know,
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is you need to have multiple rods and reels in your boat, all rigged differently.
maybe two. How's that?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, we have a few more minutes if anyone has any additional questions, but I do want to talk about stewardship. It's a big part of what we do with these presentations. And, we've been talking about especially aquatic vegetation and how important that is to fish. And what you do, not just on the lake and on your shoreline with removing vegetation is critical, but what we do off of the shore too, whether it's adding fertilizers to our lawn or even our driveways and the streets, many of our urban areas, in particular even suburban areas, we have these storm drains where water runs directly from the road into a water body, maybe a lake or a river, but for sure a water body that might eventually end up in a lake or a river. So we need to minimize the amount of chemicals we're putting on that, especially with fertilizers, because that can really impact the vegetation, but also other chemicals that can really hurt some of the animals that are at the bottom of the food chain that fish rely on and stuff. So just want to stress, folks think about that. They try to minimize that. Obviously, we have a lot of rules around what you can and can't remove from the shoreline and within, but it's so critical. I mean, it's nice to have the beach or the swimming access, and we do allow a amount of that, but as we talked about today, especially for these species, that habitat is critical, right?
Yeah. And I'll just give a quick example. So we do these little these kids talks for environmental ed days with certain counties, right? And one of the things I bring with me is an aquarium. It's just a simple 50-gallon aquarium, acrylic, completely clear, whatever. And I put one log in there. And where do you think the vast majority of fish end up in that aquarium? They are literally like right underneath that log or whatever. And that's
Mm-hmm.
just the only reason I bring that is just to show them the value of habitat. Just like we like a roof over our heads, fish like to see a roof over their heads or have something to relate to. So in our case, we're talking in Minnesota, we have a ton of Great Lakes that have excellent vegetation, and the bulrush, the cattail, the water lilies all provide valuable habitat in addition to all that submerged vegetation that we have. provides valuable habitat. The food that actually comes and it resides around that type of vegetation is critical for young of the year to survive, for the adults to survive, and provide that protection as well as shoreline stability. So a lot of things are roll up into that. So it's very valuable to have that vegetation in our area as well as wood. So
Yeah, and all our fish start little,
yeah,
and as you said, for many species, they
yeah,
relate or they need that vegetation to be able to get the food, right? Or the animals and organisms that live in the food, right?
yeah, absolutely.
All right. I got through most of the things on my that I have on my tackle box. Anything else you wanted to add or tips you have?
Yeah, so I had mentioned we'll go back to working at Topwater with you know, this is like one of my favorite baits for smallmouth on river systems, and generally speaking, is just a pop R, right? It's as simple as it sounds. It makes a little bit of sound. This particular one, they do make them without the rattles, but the tip that I'll give you is these things. They have very sharp hooks, by the way, but these things. They actually function really well with a small speed clip, not a swivel end clip, but just a clip. And the reason that I say that is they allow the bait to wobble back and forth. If you tie directly to this without a loop knot or something, it actually inhibits some of the action that they have. So one of the things that I do is I work those fairly aggressively with pauses, but fairly aggressively, and I can walk them back and forth. And that walking action with the spitting action that those little poppers do is it definitely works. There's no question about it. Smallmouths love it anyway. So
So yeah, here's another stick
yeah.
bait that you can walk. Talk about just more specifically, how do you walk the dog?
Yeah,
What's
so there,
that technique?
right, there's a cadence thing, and it takes some time to figure out, but
Practice.
generally speaking, yeah, practice. You can either hold the rod tip up and do it, but I have more effective method of controlling it just when I keep my rod tip sort of angled downward, believe it or not, at least for open water presentations, not in the heavy vegetation. In the heavy veg, you definitely want to keep the rod tip as high as you can because when you go to set the hook, you got to bring the fish up. But um, when you're doing a cadence, what I mean is like you're twitching and reeling sort of at the same time, but it's not a constant reel. It's like a pop, 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 right? So it's kind of doing a combination of both until you get the reaction out of the bait that you really want. And in the case of walking baits, like we talked about with this pop R and or the frog or the the Zara spook or something, that cadence changes depending upon the length of the bait, right? So this one's going to have a different sort of cadence than if I did this little tiny little pop bar, right? So
Mhm.
there's a difference in the way it works, but honestly, it's a matter of sort of continuous experimentation, I guess, during the retrieve to see what gets the best response out of the bait. But a little bit of
You,
slack.
you, you,
So
you typically put the rod down, right? If you're standing up and you're, at least what I do is usually the rod tip, you're pushing the rod tip down.
yeah,
Is that how you do it?
I
Okay.
usually kind of go off to the side just a
Or
hair.
you sideways.
Yeah,
Okay.
not straight down, but off to the side a bit. That's just my technique, I guess. I
Hmm.
don't
But
know.
the key is that
Yeah.
jerk and you get it to go one way and
Yep.
then you pause and jerk it, it goes the other way,
Yep.
back and forth,
Yep.
zigzagging.
Yeah, and that timing thing is definitely the critical piece of it. So
Mark asked about tips on avoiding bird nests when using a bait caster, and does the type of line matter? Yes, it
yeah,
does. But even more importantly is weighting. I've got a buzzbait, a 3/8 or even a half-ounce buzzbait on here, is weighting and adjusting your tension correctly based on the size of the lure and balancing, and we talked a little bit about this, but balancing the size of your rod and your reel and your line with the size of the lure. With these heavier lures, you can get away with using heavier line and a bigger rod, and because you can still cast it out there, and you can adjust your tension. And for what are you talking about? Bird's nest is if you use a bait caster, you have to manually stop. There's magnets and things like that that help you to stop the lure from spinning after, but the lure, the reel spins, and unlike a spinning rod where the reel is fixed and the line just goes off, in this case, the reel is spinning. So you need to stop that physically with your thumb, typically, when you cast, a gradual stop to keep it from continuing to go after the line, the rod or the lure hits the water, and the reel wants to keep going. And then if you don't, you get this mess of a backlash or bird's nest, which can be really problematic to get out and delay you from fishing for a long time. It happens to all of us. I used to, at camp, we always called it professional overrun. So it happens to the best of us. But that balance of finding the right, and then there is typically on near the handle a little tension that you can adjust how easily the reel spins. So you tighten that down for a bigger lure. I've always used the advice, like you push the bail in and let the lure from the tip of your rod, if you're holding it up like this, to fall down, and it should just gradually come out. If it goes down too fast, you're too loose. If it doesn't move at all, you're probably not loose enough. So that's the one thing I would say about that part of it. But if I'm using some of these frogs, which this one is not weighted at all, it's really hard to cast it with some of these big rods because it's just too light. So you're going to have trouble with that. I think catches so many fish, but and practice. This is one thing where, you know, once you get a bait caster, get in a big lawn area, tie on a casting plug or even one of these weedless lures, and just practice. And I'm sure there's a lot of YouTube videos online that shows you how to use a bait caster. But anything else you're going to add to that?
Yeah, I think the line type definitely can make a difference. Fluorocarbon has a tendency to kind of be a little bit more springy in general. Depends on, like, you know, monofilament has a lot of stretch to it. So there's different line types, and then diameter of the line can affect the way that the casting goes. I use almost exclusively braid. That's just my go-to. 30 to 40 pound is what I generally use for most of my angling. And then if I need something lighter or I'm working clear water, I might tie on a leader to that. But the line diameter actually can affect the way that bait casting can be effective or not, as far as the casting potential. But your advice is great. You know, just putting the rod tip up, reeling the lure all the way up to the surface, and then, or to the tip of the rod, and then popping the release, and then allowing it to drop, and just kind of fine tuning that brake adjustment just a little bit to whatever you're comfortable with. And once you get more experience, you can actually do that fairly easily. And then there's also, in general, like on Jeff's there, it also has a magnetic cast control or a centrifugal adjustment on the other side too, that allows for a little bit more fine tune, and it kind of helps on that tail end of the cast, versus the brake has a tendency to help on the overall cast and the beginning of it. So.
And this adjusts the magnetic control on it, right? And particularly effective, like if it gets windy and you're trying to cast in the wind, you might want to turn it down with more tension, and then you're not release it so that you can get a further cast. Because when you do turn it down, you won't be able to cast as far.
Exactly. So. There's a fine line between being effective with the casting and then trying to maintain control. And that's where your thumb control becomes a kind of a learned art, so to speak. So practice.
I think I got all of the questions off of the Q&A and everyone that I had. Any other things you want to add?
No, I think the best thing you can mention is just get out there and fish. I mean, we have so many neat opportunities in Minnesota, and so much public property and public availability. In places like Texas, they don't have the same kind of opportunities we do. That's hard to realize, right? So we have so much public water. You can get out in any of our rivers here, and like even from Monticello on up through Sauk Rapids. I mean, there's tons of wading opportunity for smallmouth. You know, and lots of park areas that you can access. Even down in through the Twin Cities, there's stuff that's available.
I had the figures that we've shared, I think, with the Fishing in the Neighborhood program, is you're never more than 5 minutes away from a fishing in the neighborhood pond or lake in the whole Twin Cities area.
Exactly.
So, and like you said, most of them have parkland around them, so you can walk the shore or wade in and get to some of this vegetated areas where a frog or something like that can be really effective for bass.
Absolutely.
In fact, it's, you know, you wouldn't think potentially with the Fishing Daughters Club that this is very it's a more of an advanced technique in some ways. And yes, the casting part of it, as we were talking about with bait casters and some of this heavy duty equipment, is hard. But what I did with the girls is just, I didn't fish, other than my job was to cast. When we would go in the evening at the late bite, we would go to the edge of the cattails or whatever, or the lily pads, and I would cast it out and then hand the rod over to them to work the bait back to the presentation and catch the fish. And they'd lose a lot, right? Because they either set the hook too soon or waited too long or didn't reel fast enough. But we have some of the pictures you saw actually are a couple of photos from that where the girls were able to bring in a 2-3 pound or even bigger largemouth bass, and so much fun. Again, if you've never tried it, especially at sunrise or sunrise, get out there and try a little topwater. You're just going to have so much fun with the activity of these fish chasing, especially when the bite is on. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Eric, for all of your tips. And as always, it's great having you on. Hopefully get you back in again in a future show. Speaking of that, thank you. Next week, the 31st, we have another fishing topic. It's on microfishing. I have not really tried much, but there are a lot of small, really cool fish around the world. But even in Minnesota, we have a ton of fish species that our guest is going to tell you about how to catch them and how much fun it is and how beautiful some of these fish are. So tune in for that next week. It'll be really exciting. And the week after that, for those of you that are bird fans, and about some of our non-game species, we have a talk about kestrels and the research that we're doing across state, tracking them and the things we're learning about some of these birds with some of this really fun research that's going on. So come back again, go to mndnr.gov/discover and register for the upcoming seminars. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day and get out fishing.